G'day, fools. I'm Scott Phillips, the Motley Fool's Chief Investment Officer, as you know by now. And I'm back with another. This is very quickly becoming, well, they're all my favorite series. One of my favorite YouTube series that we produce. A, I like reading, B, I like investment books, but actually, what I really like most are the books that the guys are bringing to the table. I've got to say, I expected a very, very different set of investing books. And the good news is, I didn't tell them what to present. They just said, hey, I want to talk about this book. And I went, cool. So I'm learning while you're learning. And we're doing it differently, as you might expect from the Motley Fool. You're not getting the usual suspects. You're getting the books the guys reckon you should read. And that's a different thing. Speaking of the guys, I mentioned that twice. Let's bring one in. Analyst extraordinaire, portfolio manager, lead advisor, all-round good guy, Ryan Newman. How are you, mate?
Good, thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure, mate. Thank you very much. For those who saw Stockton Focus last week, this is Rhino's back-to-back Friday and then for our favourite investing books. He's that dedicated to you, dear viewer. So I know you'll appreciate him being here. I certainly do, because frankly, me talking is really boring. So it's better to have someone else talking too. Mate, you have bought me a book, as I mentioned in the intro, that is not at all a book I would have expected. In fact, I pride myself. If someone said, like, how many, have you read a lot of investment books? Oh, yeah, I've read a lot of investing books. And yet, not only have I never read this book, mate, I've never even heard of this book. Now, before I introduce it, it is down the bottom, so you know what the book is. Hold up the cover for me, because you showed me this before we started taping. And I said, mate, the book's upside down. But it's not, is it?
In fact, it is not upside down. No, how can I prove that to you? There you go.
I open. There we go. Look at that. Mistakes were made, but not by me, by Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson. Fun title, right? So I'm guessing there's some good stories here. I guess I'll just start by saying, mate, what is the book about and why is it an investing book?
Yeah, look, so the last book that I brought to the table as well was called The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And this is another non-traditional investing book. But I think it packs some pretty important investing lessons. And I guess the lesson here is that the fact is none of us are perfect and we all make mistakes, just as whoever designed this cover did. I would say deliberately, but certainly designed otherwise. I think, though, we all have this underlying need to rationalize our decisions and our actions. Mm-hmm. We have an underlying need to think that we're smart, that we're moral, that we're right. And by doing that, I guess we have a need to justify our mistakes and make it out as though they weren't mistakes or that we weren't at fault. And what the book really does is it explores that inner conflict and how we go about dealing with it. And as I said, that's how I think it's really relevant to investors as well, because we as investors make mistakes. Now, I'm actually going to start with a quote from the book, and I'm going to read directly from the screen here. The brain is designed with blind spots, optical and psychological, and one of its cleverest tricks is to confer on us the comforting delusion that we personally do not have any. In a sense, dissonance theory is a theory of blind spots, of how and why people unintentionally blind themselves so that they fail to notice vital events and information that might make them question their behavior or their convictions. I'm almost finished this quote here. Along with the confirmation bias, the brain comes packaged with other self-serving habits that allow us to justify our own perceptions and beliefs as being accurate, realistic, and unbiased, end quote. Now, one of the big focuses is a concept called cognitive dissonance. And that's really the perception of contradicting information. When we have ideas or information that contradict each other, it's extremely uncomfortable for the human brain. And we go about ways to try and make the world make sense again, to try and make sense of those conflicting ideas. And one of the ways that we do that is to alter the information that we have. And we do this subconsciously. We do that to justify things and to put things back in order so that, again, the world makes sense to us. Now, there's two different ways that we can do that. The first way is to add new parts or contextualize the mistake. And I guess what we're doing there is rationalizing it. An example there would be, let's say your view is that smoking is a terrible habit. But I smoke a packet of cigarettes a day. Now, those two ideas there, conflicting ideas. Smoking is terrible, but I do it anyway. Yeah. So those ideas need to be rationalized. So maybe one way that we can go about rationalizing that is that, hey, I don't drink alcohol, so it's okay that I smoke a packet of cigarettes. Another way might be that hey, smoking actually helps me to keep off weight and avoid obesity. Obesity is another major health issue, so therefore smoking is good for me.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, we can actually rationalize our mistakes. The other way that we can go about this as well is to avoid contradictory information altogether. And that is something that we in investing refer to as confirmation bias. We look for information that confirm our worldviews. So
other people smoke at the same time, or it's not as bad as this, or it's not as bad as that. We justify. Is that kind of the same kind of concept, I assume?
We justify it, yeah, and I think we also go about just looking for people. It's more comfortable for us to read or listen to opinions that agree with us, and I think that's something that we've really come to understand, I guess, a lot better throughout this past 2 years. There's a whole lot of polarizing issues, whether it be COVID, whether it be politics. These are really polarizing concepts that you often don't find yourself on the fence of. They're generally very, very far apart, and it's very hard to try and meet somewhere in the middle. So, whereas in saying that, a rational stance would be probably somewhere in between those two polar opposites. The rational thing to do would be to meet somewhere in the middle. Now, I mentioned before that there are some really important investing takeaways here, and I think, Scott, you and I have a responsibility to other investors to learn from our mistakes and to try and better from them. Individual investors as well have that responsibility, predominantly to themselves, to not make the same mistakes, and to their hip pocket, to make sure that they're in a better position to build wealth over time. So we are all vulnerable to biases. We don't even know that they exist oftentimes because we choose to ignore.
That's the hardest part, right?
Blind to them.
Yeah,
that's exactly that's the hardest part. Yeah. So it can be really important and really necessary to go looking for these alternate views. And I think a good way to do that is if we're really bullish on a thesis or really bullish on a company, to go out there and actually look for that bear case. Why might this not work? Another good way to think about that is if you're buying shares, someone else is selling them. Why are they selling? What do they know?
Every single time. Yeah, that's right.
What do they know or think that we don't? What's their angle that we're not taking? So I think that's a really important point. I think the other thing, though, is that we need to recognize when we're wrong and acknowledge it so that we can reduce our chances of actually making that mistake again in the future. And I think a good way to do that is when we buy or sell shares, I think it's important that we document why we're doing that. What's the reasoning behind our decisions? Now, sometimes we can get really lucky. We can buy shares in a company that just so happen to 10 times, not for the reasons that we thought they would, but they do anyway. Yeah. It's easy to attribute that success to our own intelligence, that we were a genius in actually buying that share in the first place. Whereas in fact, no, we were just lucky. Yeah. Likewise, we could buy shares in a really promising idea that don't work out well. But we need to learn ideas, and we need to take things away from both of those experiences to better ourselves as investors over time.
Yeah, I love that, mate. It's such a difficult thing, I think, to recognize when. I mean, even as people are watching this now, there is a small portion, very small, because our viewers are very smart people, very, very thoughtful people, very self-aware people, but a very, very small number of people saying, "Yeah, well, you guys got problems, but I'm okay," or just the. I can vividly remember, mate, years and years and years ago at work, and I'd made some mistakes or done something wrong or forgotten to do whatever it was, and I was kind of making excuses and pretending and lying to the boss, trying to make it sound like everything was okay. And at one point, I kind of just went, actually, I'm just going to take responsibility for it. And I know that sounds ridiculous, right? It's a really small example. Once you do that, you actually open yourself up to actually being wrong, making mistakes. Now, I had a boss who didn't, chew me out too badly, and it was all fine and whatever. But once you kind of get off that horse of like, I need to be right, I'm sure I'm right, my ego's wrapped up in this, my self, perception. It's a really hard thing to get off that horse, because if you've built yourself up as someone who, for whom that is important, but that's your worldview, and you start to have to admit you've got problems and make mistakes and do that sort of stuff. It's why it makes investing so hard for many people, because it takes a whole lot to say, yep, you know what? I was wrong. I'm going to be wrong again. I'm probably wrong now. And still have the confidence at the same time to be an investor and to make those calls and try and beat the market at the same time as realizing that of those decisions, 3, 4, 5 out of 10 are going to be mistakes. It's its own cognitive dissonance in some way. You've got to be confident enough to make the calls, while humble enough at exactly the same moment to say, and I'm going to be wrong with some of those. And I understand how people can find it challenging, because it is really, really difficult to have both of those thoughts in your head at the same time. There's the very cognitive dissonance we talked about to try and avoid. But it's incredibly important, isn't it? Because if you can, you'll never master it. That's the other thing, right? Don't aim for perfection, because you'll never get there. But if you can start to think probabilistically, if you can recognize you'll make mistakes. By the way, some of those mistakes you make will be for the right reasons and some for the wrong reasons. That's part of it as well. There are outcomes that you were right to bet on, even if they don't happen. So it's a really, really complex web of detail. Did you find anything particular in this book? Were there particular? I love the quote, by the way. I think that's a really nice summary of what's going on. Was there a particular thing that kind of stuck out to you as maybe a particular takeaway or a particular light bulb moment, for example, from the book?
I think for me, one of the things, look, it's not specifically investing related. I think it's actually more of a political example, but
yeah, right.
It's very easy to go down that rabbit hole. And once you start going down that rabbit hole, it's very, very difficult to bring yourself back out. You can start to, it's basically layers, right? You start off with one small lie to yourself or to a partner or a colleague.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you've justified that. You can justify that.
Yeah.
You can rationalize it. And all of a sudden now it's easier to start a new lie, whether it be to yourself or your partner. And you can sort of just keep on layering, and in the end, you could end up in a really bad position. And I think at a more basic level for investors, I think if you start to acknowledge that you make mistakes and you are imperfect and you will get some investments wrong, that you can open yourself up to new opportunities and new risks. Whereas if you don't and you continually lie to yourself, you're never going to improve.
That's right. I was right, but the market's wrong again. There's no telling you get away with that before you start losing a whole lot of money. I had an interesting experience, mate. One thing I try and do personally, it's not as a result of this book, but it's kind of in the same line, is, people say I didn't have time to do something. I've trained myself to say I didn't make time to do it. And sometimes you literally didn't have time, and that's okay. But when you say I didn't have time, what you're saying is the thing out there stopped me from doing it. And so it just wasn't possible because the time wasn't available to me. And sometimes that is literally true, right? If you've got to do something by 12 o'clock and you're doing a meeting till 12, you literally don't have time. And that's fair enough. But for the most part, the things I don't get done are not things I didn't have time for. The things I didn't make time for. And that could even be fine. That could even be appropriate because I had other priorities or I needed some rest or whatever it was. But when you start to reframe that as I didn't make time to do that, or I didn't take the time to do that, rather I didn't have time, it actually helps train you, at least it does for me, to actually have that conversation with myself to say, you know what, I was able to control that, and maybe I did the wrong thing, and maybe I need to acknowledge that, or I didn't make time, and that's okay because I had other priorities. But either way, it makes you confront the fact you're in control. It's your decision. It wasn't foisted on you. You're not a victim of this stuff. I know it's not exactly what you're saying, but it's kind of one way I've tried just to reframe the way I think a little bit, just to make myself more open to what I can control, what I'm responsible for, the choices I have, which hopefully altogether make me a better investor.
Look, I think that's exactly right. And I think in terms of admitting to yourself that you've made mistakes or that you're capable of making mistakes, it can certainly put you in a better position. And you mentioned as well before the example with your work in the past that you acknowledged the mistake, you took responsibility for it, and I think on a deeper, more personal level as well, it can actually help other people to respect you a lot more for that as well. So this is a book for me that's about investing growth. It's about personality growth and also individual growth. So a really good one for me. I will end with a Peter Lynch quote, and I think we've already sort of touched on this, but Peter Lynch is esteemed as being one of the greats in terms of investing, certainly in our lifetime, certainly in yours, Scott. There's my one age joke. I think
that's the budget. That's one a video. Well done.
So the Peter Lynch quote is, in this business, if you're good, you're right 6 times out of 10. You're never going to be right 9 times out of 10. So even the best in the business, they're going to make mistakes. Individual investors will make mistakes. Institutional investors will make mistakes. Own up to them, learn from them.
Even us old blokes. Rhino, thank you for sharing this with us. I had not, as I said, read this book. I will now go and read this book. I will make time to read this book. Mistakes were made, but not by me. Love it, mate. Thank you for bringing it to us. Rhino, thank you for joining me. Thank you, viewers, for watching. On behalf of Ryan, myself, and the whole Motley Fool team, until next time, Fool on.